The Trojan War, where myth meets archaeology. Narration Draft V1, Part 1 of 8, Status, drafted 2026, Drax 07 Drax 02 by Watchdog. Not yet TTS generated. Exact Homeric quotations should be line-checked before final audio. This draft mostly paraphrases. There is a hill in northwest Anatolia that is not very large if you measure it only by height. It does not look, at first glance, like the center of a war that dragged gods down from Olympus, sent kings across the Aegean, destroyed a city, and gave the ancient world one of its most famous wounds. It is a mound, a layered rise of earth and stone near the Dardanelles, close to the narrow waterway that joins the Aegean world to the Black Sea. People have lived there, rebuilt there, argued over it, dug into it, damaged it, protected it, and imagined it for thousands of years. The name attached to it is Troy, and almost immediately that name creates a problem, because when people ask, was Troy real, they are usually asking several questions at once. Was there a real city at the place ancient tradition remembered as Troy? Yes. Was that city important enough to matter in the late Bronze Age world? Very likely, yes. Was it destroyed, rebuilt, burned, shaken, and fought over across its long history? Yes. Did a coalition of Mycenaean Greek kings sail there because a prince named Paris stole or seduced Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world? Did Achilles rage in his tent? Did Hector die beneath the walls? Did Odysseus win the war with a wooden horse? Did the gods take sides in a 10-year conflict exactly as later poetry remembered it? That is a different kind of question, and the honest answer is not a simple yes or no. The story of Troy sits in the overlap between myth and history. That overlap is where this channel lives. It is the place where memory becomes poetry, where ruins become arguments, where a real landscape gathers heroes around itself, and where truth gets exaggerated into legend. But to understand Troy, we have to resist the most tempting version of the story. We have to resist the idea that archaeology marched in, uncovered a wall, and proved Homer right. We also have to resist the opposite idea, that because Achilles cannot be excavated from the dust, the whole tradition is just fantasy with no historical gravity. Troy is more interesting than either of those answers. It is not a locked door with one key. It is a stack of rooms built on top of each other, some still visible, some damaged, some known only through texts, some preserved in poems that were sung long before they were written down. So the better question is not simply, did the Trojan War happen? The better question is, which Troy, which war, and which layer of the story are we talking about? The poem most people think of first is the Iliad, but the Iliad does not begin at the beginning of the Trojan War. It does not begin with Helen. It does not begin with the judgment of Paris. It does not begin with ships gathering in Greece, or with a prophecy, or with a wooden horse. It begins with anger, the anger of Achilles. That is already a warning. The earliest great surviving poem about Troy is not structured like a military report. It is not trying to tell us everything that happened from the first cause to the final sack. It drops us into a crisis inside the Greek camp late in the war, when the greatest fighter among the Achaeans feels dishonored by his own commander. The battlefield is there. The walls of Troy are there. Hector, Priam, Helen, Paris, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Ajax, and the gods are all part of the world of the poem, but the emotional center is not a map. It is a wound to status, honor, and grief. The Iliad is a poem about what rage does to human beings. It is a poem about glory and the cost of glory. It is a poem where warriors speak beautifully before killing each other, where the gods are powerful and petty, where a city waits under threat, and where enemies can recognize each other's humanity too late. That matters because if we treat the Iliad only as a distorted newspaper account, we lose what kind of source it is. It is a literary source, a traditional source, a performance-shaped source. It preserves names, places, formulas, memories, and old anxieties, but it does so through poetry. For generations before the text reached the form we know, singers performed stories about the heroic past. Oral tradition can preserve old material with astonishing durability. It can also compress events, rearrange motives, enlarge characters, and turn scattered conflicts into one grand war. That does not make it worthless as history. It makes it dangerous to use lazily. Imagine a real conflict remembered for centuries. Each generation retells it. A raid becomes a siege becomes a war. A local struggle becomes a clash of civilizations. A wealthy city becomes the city. A remembered fighter becomes the greatest of the Achaeans. A diplomatic crisis becomes a stolen queen. The death of one warrior becomes the grief of the whole heroic age. That process is not fantasy replacing reality. It is memory becoming myth. And myth in the ancient world was often how history survived after it stopped being paperwork. The Homeric poems reached written form long after the Late Bronze Age. The world they describe is not a perfect window into the 13th century BCE. It is layered. Some details seem older. Some belong to later Greek society. Some may be poetic convention. Some may reflect a dim memory of the palatial world that collapsed around 1200 BCE. That is why Troy is so compelling. It is not just one question. It is several overlapping timelines. There is the late Bronze Age city at Hisarlik. There is the memory of conflict around the Dardanelles. There is the early Greek poetic tradition. There are the Homeric epics as literature. There are later Greek and Roman expansions. The wooden horse, the judgment of Paris, Aeneas escaping the flames, Rome claiming descent from Troy, and then there is modern archaeology with all its hope, ambition, error, and correction. To follow Troy honestly, we have to move through all of those layers without pretending they are the same thing. So we begin not with Achilles, but with a mound of earth. The Trojan War, where myth meets archaeology, part 2 of 8. The site usually identified with ancient Troy is Hisarlik in modern Turkey, near the entrance to the Dardanelles. That position matters. A city there did not sit in an empty landscape. It stood near one of the great maritime choke points of the ancient world. Ships moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to contend with currents, winds, weighting, anchorage, and access. A settlement near that crossing could become a place of exchange, negotiation, control, and sometimes conflict. This does not mean that every detail of the Iliad becomes history. It means the location makes sense as a place people would remember. Hisarlik is not one city. It is many cities stacked on top of each other. Archaeologists speak of Troy I, Troy II, Troy III, and so on, because the mound preserves a sequence of settlements, destructions, rebuildings, and changes across thousands of years. The city associated most often with the late Bronze Age world of Homeric memory is not the earliest Troy and not the latest. Scholars have debated especially Troy VI and Troy VIIa. Troy VI was impressive. It had substantial walls, towers, and evidence of wealth and connection. It was part of a wider Anatolian and Aegean world, but it appears to have suffered destruction, likely by earthquake, around the late Bronze Age. Troy VIIa followed. It was smaller and more crowded in some interpretations, with signs that have been read as storage, pressure, and emergency conditions. It too was destroyed, around a time close to the wider Late Bronze Age collapse. Which layer, if any, belongs behind the Trojan War tradition? That question has never had a simple answer. Some scholars favor Troy VI because of its scale and grandeur. It looks like a city worthy of legend. Others point to Troy 7a because of its destruction horizon and possible signs of siege or stress. But even asking which layer is Homer's Troy can be misleading, because the poetic tradition may not preserve one event. It may preserve a remembered region, a famous city, old conflicts, and later storytelling fused together. The mound itself became a magnet for memory. In the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann excavated Hisarlik with enormous ambition and enormous damage. He was convinced he had found Homer's Troy. He cut trenches through the mound with a force that later archaeologists would regret, destroying parts of later levels in his rush toward the deeper city he imagined to be Priam's. Schliemann found treasure and announced it as the treasure of Priam. It was not Priam's. The objects came from a much earlier layer than the late Bronze Age city associated with Homeric Troy. That mistake matters because it shows how desire can shape archaeology. Schliemann wanted the poems to be true in a particular way. He wanted a direct line from Homer to gold in the ground. His discoveries were real, but his interpretation was often too dramatic, too confident, too eager. Still, the story does not end with dismissing him. Hisarlik really was an ancient city. It really did have impressive phases. It really did sit in a strategic place, and later archaeologists with more careful methods continued to show that the site was more complex and more historically significant than pure skepticism allowed. The problem was never whether there was an ancient Troy. The problem was how to connect that Troy to the stories. One of the most important modern shifts came from looking beyond the Greek side. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, left texts that mention a place called Wilusa. Many scholars connect Wilusa with Ilios, another ancient name for Troy. Hittite texts also refer to a region called Ahhiyawa, often associated by many scholars with Achaean Greeks, though details remain debated. These texts do not give us the Iliad. They do not say Achilles fought Hector, but they place a Western Anatolian polity in a diplomatic world where conflict, treaties, rebellion, and pressure from Aegean powers were possible. That changes the atmosphere of the question. Troy is no longer only a poetic city in a Greek epic. It becomes part of a larger late Bronze Age international system where great kings wrote to each other, vassal states shifted loyalties, and the western edge of Anatolia was contested, connected, and watched. The ancient world behind the legend begins to come into focus, not as a movie version of Homer, as a political landscape where a story like Troy could grow. The Trojan War, Where Myth Meets Archaeology, Part 3 of 8. If we step back from the walls of Troy and look across the late Bronze Age Aegean, the world becomes stranger and larger. The Greek side of the Trojan story belongs, at least in memory, to the Mycenaean Age. This was not the Greece of marble temples and classical democracy. It was a palace world. Centers like Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Tiryns were ruled by elites whose power was recorded not in alphabetic Greek, but in Linear B tablets, administrative documents written in an early form of Greek. Those tablets are not epics. They are lists, allocations, personnel records, offerings, goods, animals, metal, wheels, armor, and bureaucracy. They show us a world of palatial management, chariots, bronze, textiles, landholding, religious offerings, and specialized labor. They do not tell the story of Helen, but they do show that the Mycenaean world had the organization and maritime capacity for military ventures, raiding, exchange, and conflict. The Homeric poems remember a world of kings: Agamemnon of Mycenae, Menelaus of Sparta, Nestor of Pylos, Odysseus of Ithaca. Some names and places fit awkwardly with later Greek geography and politics, as if the poems preserve an older heroic map. That does not prove the war happened as told, but it suggests that the tradition is not simply invented from nothing in a later age. The world that could produce such memories existed. It was wealthy, it was violent, it was connected, and it eventually collapsed. Around the end of the Bronze Age, across the eastern Mediterranean, palace systems failed, cities were destroyed or abandoned, trade networks broke, populations moved, and old powers weakened. The causes are still debated: climate stress, earthquake, rebellion, invasion, systems collapse, trade disruption, internal fragility, and war may all have played roles. This matters for Troy because the traditional setting of the war belongs near the edge of that turbulent world, a wealthy city near a strategic strait, a Mycenaean world capable of overseas action, a Hittite sphere of influence in Anatolia, diplomatic tension, regional conflict, the weakening of palace systems. That is not the Iliad, but it is a plausible historical soil from which a Trojan War tradition could grow. The mistake is to demand too much or too little from the evidence. Too much would be to say, because there was a real Troy, Achilles was real exactly as the poem describes. Too little would be to say, because Achilles cannot be proven, the city and its conflicts do not matter. The better answer is layered. There may have been one or more conflicts around Troy in the late Bronze Age. There may have been memories of Mycenaean activity in western Anatolia. There may have been a destruction event that later poets attached to a heroic story. There may have been famous names, dynastic memories, or local traditions that survived in altered form, and there was definitely a city at Hisarlik whose archaeology shows long occupation, importance, and destruction. The myth did not float in empty air, but it did not preserve history untouched. This is why the Trojan War remains one of the most useful examples of how ancient memory works. It forces us to ask what kind of truth we are looking for: a literal truth, a poetic truth, a historical core, a cultural memory, a landscape remembered because it mattered, a later Greek imagination building identity from the ruins of an older world. For Troy, the answer is probably all of these, but not in equal measure. The Trojan War, Where Myth Meets Archaeology, Part 4 of 8. The most famous cause of the Trojan War is not strategic geography, it is Helen. In later tradition, Paris of Troy judges a contest between goddesses and awards the prize to Aphrodite, who promises him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris travels to Sparta, takes Helen, and brings her to Troy. The Greek kings gather to recover her. A personal scandal becomes an international war. This story is unforgettable. It gives the war a human face. Desire, betrayal, honor, marriage, guest friendship, pride, and revenge are all condensed into one image: Helen on the walls of Troy, looking down at the men who are dying because of her. But historically, Helen is not a cause we can verify. She belongs to the mythic structure of the story. That does not make her unimportant. It means she explains the war in the language of heroic poetry, not in the language of Bronze Age diplomacy. Ancient stories often personify conflict. A woman can become the symbol of an alliance. A marriage can stand for a political bond. A stolen bride can encode broken hospitality, treaty violation, or elite competition. The abduction motif appears in many mythic traditions because it turns complex disputes into a story listeners can feel. Helen may not tell us what happened. She tells us what kind of story the Greeks thought the war was: a war over beauty, a war over honor, a war over desire that becomes public catastrophe. But the poems themselves are more complicated than the simplest retellings. In the Iliad, Helen is not only a prize. She is self-aware, sorrowful, ashamed, and strangely perceptive. Priam treats her with gentleness. The Trojan elders acknowledge her beauty while wishing the war would end. She becomes both cause and witness, blamed and pitied, central and powerless. That complexity is one reason the Trojan tradition survived. It is not just a siege story. It is a tragedy of entangled responsibility. The same is true of Achilles. If we are asking for the historical Achilles, archaeology gives us nothing certain. There is no grave that can be named his with confidence, no linear B tablet saying Achilles, son of Peleus, fought at Troy, no Hittite letter describing a warrior like him. But as a poetic figure, Achilles is one of the ancient world's deepest meditations on mortality. He knows that glory and death are tied together. He can choose a long, obscure life or a short life remembered forever. His rage nearly destroys his own side. His grief after Patroclus dies becomes catastrophic. And when he meets Priam, the father of the man he killed, the poem pauses the machinery of war long enough for enemies to weep together. That scene is not archaeology, but it is truth of another kind. It tells us what the tradition thought war did to human beings. It tells us that even in a story filled with gods, the most powerful moments are often human. An old father begging for his son's body, a warrior remembering his own father, two enemies sharing grief across the corpse of the dead. If the historical core of Troy was a conflict over trade, power, or regional instability, the poem transformed it into something larger. It made war emotionally legible. It turned a city into a stage where honor, rage, beauty, mortality, and memory could be tested. That transformation is exactly why Troy survived when so many other Bronze Age conflicts disappeared into silence. The poems did not preserve a file. They preserved a wound. The Trojan War, where myth meets archaeology, Part 5 of 8. If Achilles gives the Trojan War its rage, Hector gives it its city. Hector is not fighting for abstract glory in the same way. He is defending Troy, his father Priam, his wife Andromache, his child, his people, the walls, the houses, the future that will vanish if the city falls. In the Iliad, one of the most haunting scenes is not a battle. It is Hector meeting Andromache and their infant son. She pleads with him not to return to the fighting. He knows what will happen if Troy falls. He imagines Andromache taken captive, forced to work for strangers, and someone saying, "That was the wife of Hector." He cannot save her by staying. He cannot save her by going. This is the tragedy of the city. Troy is not only a fortress, it is a community under sentence. Historically, we cannot know whether any Hector stood on the walls of Hisarlik, but archaeology can remind us that cities are not metaphors, they are inhabited places. A destruction layer is not just a line in a report. It means houses burned, walls collapsed, people fled, died, returned, or were replaced. It means storage jars, tools, bones, pottery, ash, and abandoned spaces. When ancient poets imagined the fall of Troy, they were not imagining a chessboard. They were imagining the end of a world. Later traditions tell the actual sack more fully than the Iliad does. The Iliad ends before the wooden horse and before the city falls. The horse belongs to the wider epic cycle and later retellings, especially the Odyssey and later authors. That is another important distinction. Many things people think are in Homer are not in the Iliad itself. The judgment of Paris, the early gathering of the fleet, the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Achilles' heel, the wooden horse in full detail, and the final burning of Troy are spread across later traditions, summaries, tragedies, vase paintings, Roman epic, and mythographic retellings. The Trojan War is not one book. It is a tradition. That tradition grew. Greek tragedians reworked it. Artists painted it. Romans claimed descent from it through Aeneas. Medieval Europe reimagined it through chivalric romance. Modern nationalism, archaeology, cinema, and popular history kept reshaping it. This matters because when we ask whether the Trojan War is true, we have to ask which version. Is the wooden horse historical? Probably not in the literal form later storytelling gives it. Could there have been a trick, a siege engine, a symbolic memory, a ritual object, or simply a brilliant narrative device attached to a city's fall? Possibly. But we should be careful. The horse is powerful because it turns Troy's strength against itself. The city that survived open assault is destroyed when it brings the danger inside its own walls. As history, the horse is doubtful. As myth, it is perfect. And that is often how myths work. They do not always preserve the factual mechanism of an event. They preserve the meaning people gave it. Troy fell because of deception. Troy fell because pride ignored warning. Troy fell because the boundary between outside and inside was violated. Troy fell because what looked like a gift was a weapon. That is why the horse survives. The Trojan War, where myth meets archaeology, part 6 of 8. There is another reason Troy became so powerful. It gave later peoples a past. For Greeks, the Trojan War became a shared heroic memory. The warriors who fought there were ancestors of story, models of courage and failure, examples to imitate and warnings to fear. The war became a reference point for identity, a time when the Achaeans crossed the sea together, when heroes lived closer to the gods, when fame was won at terrible cost. For Romans, Troy became even more important. In Virgil's Aeneid, written many centuries after the Greek epic tradition, the Trojan prince Aeneas escapes the burning city and carries his household gods into exile. His journey eventually leads toward Italy, making Troy part of Rome's origin story. This is not archaeology of the late Bronze Age. It is cultural memory being adopted and transformed by a new power. Rome did not merely inherit Troy. Rome reinterpreted it. The defeated Trojan becomes ancestor of empire. The city destroyed by Greeks becomes seed of a future world power. Troy's fall becomes Rome's beginning. That is a remarkable reversal, and it shows how myths can travel far beyond their first historical setting. A local conflict, if there was one, became Greek epic. Greek epic became Roman origin. Roman origin became medieval genealogy. Medieval genealogy became European imagination. Modern archaeology then returned to the mound, looking for the historical spark beneath all those layers. By then, Troy was no longer only a site in Anatolia. It was a mirror. Each age saw something in it: heroism, betrayal, empire, ruin, national ancestry, literary beauty, archaeological proof, the danger of wishful thinking, the thrill of finding a city thought lost. That is why Troy can be abused. Whenever a myth is famous enough, people try to make it prove more than it can prove. Some want Troy to validate every detail of heroic legend. Others want it to serve nationalist fantasies or racial myths. Others reduce archaeology to treasure hunting, as if gold is more important than context. And some modern retellings treat the discovery of Troy as a simple triumph. Schliemann found it, Homer was right, case closed. But the real story is more subtle and more valuable. Archaeology did not prove the Iliad in a literal sense. It showed that the tradition was anchored to a real place of great antiquity and importance. Texts from the wider Anatolian world did not prove Achilles. They made it more plausible that Western Anatolia was a politically complex frontier where Aegean powers and local kingdoms interacted. The destruction layers did not prove a 10-year war over Helen. They showed that the city suffered crises in the right broad era for later memory to attach significance. The poems did not give us a clean historical record. They gave us a cultural memory dense enough to preserve old names and landscapes while transforming them into art. That is the lesson of Troy. Not that myth is secretly just history. Not that history dissolves myth, but that the two can interlock. The ruins give the poem weight. The poem gives the ruins voice. The Trojan War, where myth meets archaeology, part 7 of 8. So what can we say carefully about the Trojan War? We can say that a major ancient settlement existed at Hisarlik, in the region later associated with Troy. We can say that it had multiple layers, including impressive Bronze Age phases. We can say that it occupied a strategically meaningful position near the Dardanelles. We can say that it was destroyed and rebuilt more than once. We can say that late Bronze Age Western Anatolia was connected to both the Hittite world and the Aegean world, and that texts mentioning Wilusa and Ahhiyawa may preserve names related to Troy and the Achaeans. We can say that Mycenaean Greek palatial society was capable of organized warfare, maritime movement, and elite competition. We can say that the Homeric tradition preserves an old heroic memory, but in poetic form, shaped by oral performance and later textual transmission. We cannot say that the Iliad is a literal report. We cannot confirm Helen, Paris, Achilles, Hector, or the wooden horse as historical facts. We cannot reduce a complex archaeological sequence to one dramatic burning that matches the poem neatly, and we cannot pretend that finding a real Troy means every later story about Troy is equally historical. The honest position is more interesting. There was a Troy. There may have been one or more wars or conflicts remembered behind the legend. The Greek epic tradition transformed that memory into a story about rage, honor, grief, beauty, deception, and the destruction of a city. Later cultures kept transforming it because Troy was useful for thinking about origins, loss, and identity. That is why the Trojan War still matters. It is not simply that a famous myth might have a historical core. It is that the process is visible. We can see archaeology, texts, landscape, oral poetry, political memory, and later reception all layered together. Troy teaches us how legends are made, not from nothing, and not from pure fact, from pressure, from places people remember, from conflicts that leave scars, from songs that outlive archives, from ruins that later generations cannot stop interpreting. When you stand before the idea of Troy, you are standing before more than a battlefield. You are standing before one of humanity's oldest arguments about memory. What does it mean for a story to be true? If Achilles never lived, can the Iliad still tell the truth about war? If Helen was not the cause, can her story still reveal how societies explain catastrophe through desire and honor? If the wooden horse never stood inside the gates, can it still preserve the ancient fear that destruction often arrives disguised as salvation? If archaeology cannot prove the poem, can the ruins still show us why the poem had somewhere real to root itself? Troy answers all of these questions imperfectly. That imperfection is the point. The Trojan War, where myth meets archaeology, part 8 of 8. At the end, Troy remains layered. The lowest layers belong to archaeology: stone, mud brick, pottery, ash, bones, walls, gates, destruction, rebuilding. Above that are the political layers: Anatolian kingdoms, Hittite diplomacy, Aegean contact, Mycenaean power, trade routes, choke points, and the instability of the late Bronze Age. Above that are the poetic layers: Achilles, Hector, Helen, Priam, Paris, Odysseus, gods on the battlefield, speeches before death, grief so large it seems to bend the world. Above that are the later layers: the wooden horse, Aeneas, Rome, medieval genealogies, Renaissance paintings, archaeological ambition, modern films, and the endless desire to know whether the story was real. The answer is that Troy was real. The war may preserve memories of real conflict, but the Trojan War as we inherit it is not just an event, it is a monument made of memory. And like all monuments, it tells us about the people who built it, rebuilt it, and returned to it. The ancient singers did not give us a clean excavation report. They gave us a city where human beings could ask what glory costs. They gave us a warrior who could win fame and lose himself. They gave us a defender who knew his city would fall and fought anyway. They gave us an old king who kissed the hands of the man who killed his son. They gave us a woman blamed for a war she could not control. They gave us gods who made human suffering larger, but not less human. And beneath all of that, somewhere near the Dardanelles, there was a mound, a real place, a place where walls rose and fell, a place where later generations came looking for proof and found something more complicated. That is where myth and history overlap. Not in the fantasy that every beautiful story is literally true, and not in the cynicism that old stories are worthless unless they behave like modern documents. They overlap in places like Troy, where the earth preserves one kind of memory and poetry preserves another. Between them, we do not get certainty, we get depth, and sometimes depth is more honest than certainty. The Trojan War, then, is not solved by choosing between Homer and archaeology. It is understood by listening to both carefully and by refusing to make either one say more than it can. A city stood, a tradition remembered, a poem transformed, a ruin endured, and thousands of years later we are still standing at the edge of that mound, asking the same question ancient people asked in their own way. What survives when a world burns? For Troy the answer was not only stone, it was story.